February, so...
Oh, there you go then, there you go.
Yeah.
Right, what we're planning, I think, insofar as it's planned, is something fairly informal. I'm Cyril Pearce. We've got Jack Burrows here from Nelson, who's going to fill in on the bits I'm ignorant of in terms of Nelson in particular and some of the people and places and so forth. We've got Alison Ronan here, who's going to add a particular dimension where women's contributions to the theme are concerned. And the theme, as you probably gathered from the boards just outside this room, is Nelson in the First World War and the extent to which Nelson in the First World War was what I've called in my book, a hotbed of anti-war feeling. I thought it might be useful to start off what I want to say by explaining how it is that a Yorkshireman from Huddersfield is here in Nelson talking about Nelson history. And perhaps just a few slides to explain how that's all happened and where Nelson fits into the bigger picture of the British anti-war movement in the First World War. When you start to look at a lot of the texts and certainly at the material that was around at the time of the First World War, you'll find conscientious objectors, war resistors in general, men in particular, but also women, don't get a particularly good press. This is a classic First World War anti-conscientious objector postcard, and there you are, there's the recruiting sergeant out in the street there, buttonholing that poor chap, saying more or less, why aren't you in uniform, your country needs you, go down to the recruiting office and get your name down there. And here across the other side of the road, looking out for the recruiting sergeant, hoping to avoid him, is a man in a frock. And the implication, of course, is that this man in a frock is wearing women's clothing to avoid being called up. The only way, what's it say there? Can anyone read it?
The only way.
Recruiting sergeants in every street are stopping all slackers they chance to meet, and the poor old nut has got the pip, so he wears a skirt to give him the slip. The reality, of course, is only about 2 or 3 cases of men dressing up as women to avoid military service. But that's where a lot of the press coverage rests, I suppose, during the time of the First World War. You'll also find, along with these lampoons of war resistors, stories of individual conscientious objector heroism, if you like, men who refused to be enlisted, who were sent into the army, were court-martialed, served time in prison. Here are 3 of the more famous ones. Clifford Allen, one of the leading figures in the No Conscription Fellowship, the organisation which drew all the war resistors together. Bert Brocklesby, a Methodist lay preacher from Conisbrough near Doncaster, another key figure in the story of the anti-war movement, and a Quaker conscientious objector, Corder Catchpool, who initially joined the Friends Ambulance Unit, as many Quakers did in 1914, served with distinction with the Friends Ambulance Unit in Belgium and France, but when conscription came in 1916, he took the view that he wanted to come back to England to state his case as an opponent of war. He left the Friends Ambulance Unit, came back, went before the local tribunal to make his case as a conscientious objector, refused to accept any of what the tribunal would give him, and he, like Clifford Allen, Bert Brocklesby, and about 16,000 others at the very least, ended up for a time, certainly in prison. But my association with the anti-war movement and my association that led to my doing some work on it began rather more humbly and less dramatically in this terrace house in Brighouse. Brighouse is on the road between Huddersfield, the centre of my particular universe, and Bradford. And the guy who lived in this terrace house, and I went to interview him in the late 1960s when I was only a child, was the man on the left there, Wilfred Whiteley. Wilfred Whiteley had just retired from a very active life in local politics in Brighouse, and further afield. At one time, he'd been Labour Member of Parliament for Ladywood in Birmingham, and so on. A very interesting life, and I wanted to find out more about Wilf. And we got talking about his life, and we got to the time of the First World War, and he said, well, I was a conscientious objector in the First World War. And I said, what was that like? And where was he from? He's from Huddersfield. And he said that Huddersfield in the First World War was a bit special, because there were lots of COs, they were well supported in the town, they had a good local organisation. They were a minority, but nevertheless, they were a well supported group of individuals, about 120 of them, and they had a good organisation. He said, you ought to talk to Arthur. So I went to talk to the man in the middle there, Arthur Gardner. Arthur Gardner, about the same age as Wilf. They've all gone, the people on the picture now, sadly. And he said the same. He was a conscientious objector. Very different sort of conscientious objector from Wilf. Wilf was an ethical ILP conscientious objector. Arthur Gardner was a straight down the line Marxist who believed the First World War was a war for markets and empire, and he wanted nothing to do with it. And so he was a CO too. And he said just what Wilf had said, that Huddersfield in the First World War was a special place, and for the same reasons.
Next to Nelson.
Oh, it's not as important as Nelson in all sorts of ways. I'll come to that later on. But this is where it all began for me. Some years later, I got talking to Florence Shaw, who'd been very active in the anti-war movement in the town, supporting people like Wilf and Arthur, fundraising, leafleting, organising meetings and so on. And Florence said just the same. The town was special and so on. And so out of that very clear steer, it was obvious what I had to do was to find out whether it was special. Yeah, and that's where the first book came from. The Comrades in Conscience is an exploration of the idea that Huddersfield was a bit special in the First World War. And I did find that there were strands in the anti-war community in Huddersfield that had echoes in other parts of the country. Here, for example, sitting in the middle of the front row there, the middle row rather, is Wilfred Whiteley. Independent Labour Party activists, in particular, perhaps because of his chapel background, because he was brought up Baptist, he was very popular at Socialist Sunday School anniversaries as the man to deliver the annual address, if you like, to the people at the Socialist Sunday School. He became known as the Socialist Sunday School anniversary man. And he was very popular in Yorkshire and in Socialist Sunday Schools in Lancashire too. But here they all were, members of the Huddersfield Socialist Sunday School, at least one branch of it, because there were two of them. The ILP one and another one I'll speak about in a moment. And they were all anti-war. The Socialist Sunday School movement generally, apart from one or two branches, one I think in Bradford certainly, were all solidly opposed to the war, and the young men associated with them found whatever way they could to refuse to serve. So we've got the ILP and the Socialist Sunday School backing the Conscientious Objectors and contributing members to the Conscientious Objector movement. You've also got Huddersfield's British Socialist Party, and there is Arthur Gardner, and here, as a young lass of about 13, is Florence. All the men in this picture, and it was taken in January 1916 when conscription was about to come in, all the young men of military service age in this picture decided that they would oppose the war. And they were all conscientious objectors. Some found they got work that was regarded as national importance. Here, for example, Fred Shaw here, Amalgamated Society of Engineers branch secretary. His work was regarded as being war essential, and so he was exempt. Jess Townend here was the local branch secretary of the Workers' Union, and his work was regarded as being war exempt. So he supported the anti-war movement, but didn't have to suffer what the conscientious objectors did. So we've got the ILP, we've got the Socialist Sunday School, we've got the BSP. We've even got the local Trades Council, meeting here in the old Huddersfield Friendly and Trades Club on regular occasions throughout the war. When the matter of conscription was debated, the majority was critical of conscription or refusing to accept it. And supporting all of that and backed up by it was the local newspaper, The Worker. Its editor, George Thomas, and its principal reporter, William Dixon, were both themselves conscientious objectors and eventually ended up in prison, and the worker had to carry on through the war, run by a group of Socialist and Labour Party members on an ad hoc basis. And perhaps the clinching thing that you'll find in lots of other places is that not only have you got that kind of left community supporting the war resistors, ILP, BSP, Social Sunday School, Trades Councils and so on, but you've also got a very supportive Quaker community. Here's the Huddersfield meeting house of the Society of Friends, and among the Society of Friends members in Huddersfield, we have some very important people. I'm sure that Ali will mention one of them who ended up in Manchester. But here we are, Alice and Julia Robson, and their brother John Edward. Well-to-do, the family owned a dye works in a part of Huddersfield, but they were all radical liberals who cut their ties with the Liberal Party in 1914 when the war broke out, and threw in their lot as best they could with the anti-war movement. Alice and Julia, very active in support organisations for conscientious objectors. John Edward was war exempt despite the fact he was of an age, because the work at the dye works was regarded as being war essential, but he continued with his sisters to campaign against the war.
Is that woman, Nelson?
I beg pardon?
That Alice Cooper?
No, she's Alice Robson.
Ah.
These are all the Robson children. There's another one, Connie Robson, who became Crossland, who ended up in Manchester and doing just the same thing that Alice and Julia were doing back in Huddersfield, where the family came from. And just to add another layer, if you like, this redoubtable woman, she had to be a suffragette, didn't she? Edith Key, very active in Huddersfield Independent Labour Party, local branch secretary of the Women's Social and Political Union, a suffragette, mother of 2 conscientious objectors. In fact, one of them, who actually went on the run and ended up in Canada, she was part of that community as well, if you like, this community of war resistors. Now, okay, so the book, Comrades in Conscience, as far as I'm aware, makes the point about Huddersfield being special. The next thing to do, of course, is to find out whether there were other places like Huddersfield. It's sad to say, but very few pieces of work, such as the one I did in Huddersfield, have ever been done. I suspect the reason that's because it's hard work. It takes a lot of time, and you're not sure what you've got at the end of it. But I came up with this notion that perhaps if I started counting conscientious objectors, not accepting conscientious objectors are the only thing, but perhaps as a beginning, an indicator. If I started counting conscientious objectors and collecting as much data about them as I could, that I might be able to produce maps showing us where the CEOs were right across the country where conscription applied, England, Scotland and Wales. And we did that. We now have a database of 19,900 names, most of which we can actually plot and place on the map. So I can say that I've got 100 CEOs from Nelson, and on practically 90 odd of them, I can actually give you their address. Here in Vernon Street even, we came across 2 in Vernon Street only earlier this morning. Now we can do that across the country with the database. And then we can start to plot them. Here, for example, is a territory that I know little about, Essex. Being Yorkshireman, we don't get down to Essex. And the red dots here indicate the size of the local anti-war community. In other words, a big red dot, there's a lot of them. A small red dot, there's not many. Okay? What's interesting though is, those numbers might simply be a reflection of the local population. Yeah? So a big place, you'd expect a big dot anyway, wouldn't you? Small place, small dot. Crucial bit, of course, is trying to find out how those numbers rather are as a proportion of the local population. Now, various bits of arithmetic, straightforward stuff, allows you to calculate the number of conscientious objectors per 1,000 men eligible to serve. In a crude way, eligible age for service is 18 to 40. So we can calculate how many men per 1,000 of population were conscientious objectors. And then we get something that I've started to call a CO index. And when we apply that CO index to Essex, yeah, this area of dark red is that part of Essex which has got the highest proportion of COs per local population. It's a rural district, it's called Rochford Rural District, and it has a very specific reason why it has such a high proportion of COs, because Rochford Rural District in Essex, rural Essex, is the home of a particularly interesting nonconformist sect called the Peculiar People. And then they've adopted that name themselves, they're still there, and here are the men of the Peculiar People of Rochford at Dartmoor. The community had decided that they would oppose the war because it was not God's will, and they would take the consequences. They went to tribunal, pleaded their faith, they were refused, they went into the army, they were court-martialed, they ended up going to prison and then taking the Home Office scheme, ending up on Dartmoor, Wakefield, Warwick, and various other work centres across the country. Other places are less specific in terms of the motivation of the war resistors. Here, for example, is, again, a place I know little about, Hertfordshire. And you can see that the number of COs is a fairly thin scatter. Yeah? Down here is Watford, and Watford Rural District around it. Again, a specific reason why there's a decent sized dot there, because within the area of Watford Rural District, you've got the training centre and training college for the Seventh-day Adventist Church ministers. Yeah? A place called Stanmore Park. But here's the intriguing one, this big dot up here. It's in Hitchin Rural District, and that's Hitchin. And when you do that about densities, clearly Hitchin Rural District is the most interesting part of Hertfordshire. Watford down here still looks good in terms of number of COs per eligible men, but what's going on in Hitchin Rural District? Well, the answer again is fairly straightforward, in that within Hitchin Rural District there is Letchworth, one of the first, in fact the first, garden city. Began building around about 1906. By 1914 it was fairly well established as a big town, or well, as a growing town, and it was a sort of place idealistically intended with an interesting mix of built and rural, if you like, a model example of how towns should be built, that attracted what, for want of a better term, I suppose, I'd call guardian readers. People generally on the left, yes, who would go there because it was the place to go. And these were people who had a critical view of all things political, and particularly critical view of the war. And you'll find them interesting in lots of ways. Here's what people from outside thought of them. Yeah, here we've got examples of men in rational dress, a smock. Edward Carpenter, the sage of Sheffield, as it were, advocated men's wearing skirts, very pleased with kilts and things, because he reckoned that skirts were a more, what shall I say, hygienic form of garment for the lower regions. And here we have them. And again, classic images at the time. Here's a bald guy with a big beard digging his allotment with his sandals on. I don't know how. Have you ever tried digging with sandals on? It's not the easiest. It makes your feet very dirty. It's not the easiest thing in the world. If you look a bit closer, Letchworth became a kind of tourist attraction. And here's a bunch of tourists looking around, and if you get in a bit closer, Daddy, I want to see them feed. As a small tourist child. And we've got signs to all manner of things, the nut eaters and goodness knows what else. So Letchworth is a bit predictable as the home of curiosities, and easily lampooned. And then we start to look at Lancashire. Here's the map of Lancashire as it was at the time of the First World War. These are the boundaries of the county. Within them, these smaller boundaries, these lesser boundaries, are the boundaries of what were the local government areas at that time. Urban districts, rural districts, county boroughs, cities, and not surprisingly, you'll recognise immediately Liverpool, big dot, Manchester, a bigger dot, and a very interesting sequence of middling-sized dots, and Blackbird there, into the Pennine region. What's going on there? Well, when you do that thing with the CO index and look at the map then, here's Nelson, here's Rottenstone.
It's me.
Okay, and clearly those are two places which are worth looking at. What the database does for you, it says, look, here are places where data seems to suggest we should be taking a closer look. And the book I finally finished writing last year, which is on the table there, is an attempt to come to grips with all the data that's come out of the database and what it starts to mean. Nelson, like Huddersfield, although more so, because I think the anti-war movement in Nelson was more important in terms of the population of the town than it was in my hometown. I don't willingly concede that, but I have to, especially to Lancashire. But anyway, I've also had to concede it to a lot of other places, including Bristol, would you believe? So Huddersfield's still special to me, but in terms of the grand sweep of anti-war communities, there are places where the anti-war community was stronger, more numerous, and ultimately more influential. Here we're in the building where we now are. This is a picture from before, I think, the windows were replaced.
Yeah. Oh no, it's not.
We have the Socialist Institute, we have Clarion House, indicative of a movement of a very different kind from the one I found in Huddersfield. We have a bunch of war resistors. Jack, you want to say anything? This is Jack's dad.
Yes, the second from the right on the top there is Dan Paradise. There's a lady who's been inquiring. I don't know whether I can speak about the CEOs. I can probably do it later, but I have tales to tell about Dan to this lady.
Thank you.
My father is in the middle of the middle row, and surprisingly, I'm the direct descendant of him, probably the only one in the country who was a direct descendant of a First War Conscientious Objector. That came from our archives. I haven't seen any other, from the family archives, I haven't seen any other photographs similar to this from anywhere else in Nelson. So it's lucky that my parents kept hold of this photo.
What intrigued me when we were talking about this before, Jack, is how you refer to so many of them as uncle this, that and the other.
Yes,
despite
well,
they weren't related.
Down on the bottom row is Euclid Thursby, well known, which probably Cyril will get onto later. Second from the right on the bottom row is my uncle Frank Butterfield, a well-known family in this area.
Yeah, definitely another Frank.
And his brother is in the top right corner, Jim Butterfield, another uncle. In fact, most of these I grew up with and called uncle. I didn't have a direct uncle there, but there's only about 2 names on there which I don't recollect. All the others I've been with, walked over to the Clarion with. I can talk about that later to anybody who's really interested.
I got
Sorry,
you.
sorry, I'm just gonna, I've got to, sorry, I've
So
got to go.
if you
Sorry,
find your way out.
Yes, I don't want to watch it over there.
Yeah.
I'll move.
Yeah.
I managed to make contact with Euclid's family, and so we do have some other photographs of Nelson CEOs, and particularly of Euclid, with the amazing name, Euclid, Voltaire, Tesla, Thursby. And here he is, and I'm sure there are Nelson men there, but there's Euclid, sitting on the front row with the power loom department at Wakefield Work Centre. Wakefield Prison was, of course, decommissioned as a prison during the war, as was Dartmoor. as was Warwick and one or two others, and it was used as a work centre, a kind of work camp into which the CEOs were decanted, as it were. They were ended up almost run by CEOs, frankly.
Excellent.
Did the chair break?
It's an historic chair.
Sat on a bin. Sat on a bin.
So there's Euclid. They ran them more or less as they within the regulations. At Wakefield, they also entertained themselves in all sorts of ways. There was a concert party, and also the ones who liked playing football, they actually staged an England-Scotland football match. And here, I think, wish fulfillment as Euclid playing for England. I don't know where they got the shirts from.
I don't know if you've seen, Cyril, I think it's at Warwick. They've got a wonderful thing from Wakefield, which is a petition about having cocoa. Have you seen it? And it's, I meant to bring it today, but I didn't think it would be relevant. So it's something about, they write it as a plea to the governor, and they go, it's the delectable delights of the, you know, it's written in absolute and signed by all the people, saying that not everybody needs tea and some people need cocoa. Right. So it's on the Warwick University archive. It's great fun and signed by all the people. Yeah. And at the bottom there's a little addendum that says, and on a particular day, cocoa was served. So.
Excellent. The result, which is not quite what we can say for the people of the women of the Croydon No Conscription Fellowship, because they petitioned the Home Secretary, I think, in December 1917 for permission to send Christmas puddings to conscientious objectors in Werwood Scrubs, but the Home Secretary decided not, he couldn't allow that, so they were denied their Christmas pud.
Well, they had the Benny and Hot, didn't they?
And here's what happened to Jack's family.
That's my father lying down, yes.
Wow.
There he is.
I think we've got this one outside on the board.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Is this at Dartmoor?
That's at Dartmoor.
Yeah.
That's in Dartmoor, yeah.
It's on the wall outside.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The interesting thing too, I think, about Nelson, which distinguishes it from Huddersfield, is that among the people who were supporting the anti-war cause in Nelson were some local people who were quite distinguished in their own way and became even more distinguished after the war. One of these was Wilfred Weller, a man with a very, very interesting background, a journalist, a writer, eventually a socialist, although not initially a socialist as far as I understand it. He was also a conscientious objector, and he became very important, I think, in the post-war anti-war community. One of the original members of the No More War movement, of the Peace Pledge Union, and so on. And the bit I find intriguing about him is in the 1950s, shortly before he died, he had himself I think it was a market garden, wasn't it, Jack?
Yes.
Somewhere near Preston.
Yes, he grew all his own vegetables.
Yeah. And he was an early advocate of what the Henry Doubleday Foundation was all about, the Soil Society. Yeah, I think he was the Lancashire branch chair or something like that. Very interesting man. Some people I know are very intrigued by this connection, historic connection between the left and green issues. We can see them in the work of William Morris in the 19th century, and it's interesting they're getting rediscovered, I think, by the green movement these days, and long may that continue. I think that might well be a way forward.
Cyril, can I add a little?
Yeah, of course you can, Jack, yeah.
Wilfred, well, was a cousin of my mother's. Yeah, my grandmother was a valet. And he appeared in front of the local tribunals, I think, on 3 occasions, certainly 2. And of course you knew all the councillors and the people on the tribunal. And they kept deferring him. And eventually he said, no, I want no more deferment. I want to be just the same as all the other conscientious objectors. And he refused deferment, and of course then he went down to Werwood Scrubs. And he came back at the end of the war with the shock of white hair. It was quite normal around when he went in.
There's another character here, Ethel Carney Holdsworth, or Ethel Carney. Slightly at a distance from the main core, I think, of the anti-war movement, but nevertheless part of the propaganda and the culture of opposition to the war. She was a textile worker, a poet, journalist, writer, a radical suffragist, a socialist and a pacifist. And of course, the star as far as the women's side of the movement is concerned is Selina Cooper, very active in the anti-war movement, very active in women's trade unionism here in Nelson, and of course later very important in Nelson local politics between the wars.
They have their house, don't they, on St Mary Street?
Yeah, 59,
Yeah.
you've got a blue plaque on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
I
of
live on
course.
St Mary's, that's why we're asking before.
Oh,
do
yeah,
you?
alright,
Ah.
okay.
And that really is my intro to Ali.
I don't know if Jack wants to
That
say.
you wanna say
No,
something?
no, you
Can you turn the lights on? please?
Okay. Hi, my name's Ali Vernon, and I haven't done anything so fantastic as this. So you'll just have to listen to me chat, I'm afraid. And thank you to Cyril, because it's always just so extraordinary to hear about these stories about the conscientious objectors. And the fact that there are nearly 20,000 of them, I think, is enormous. And also the fact that we can actually begin to plot where they live. So I live in Manchester, and my initial interest in this was doing some work about women in the anti-war movement. So I wanted